I found the old guest book safe wedged behind a false panel in the library's chimney breast on a Thursday, still dusty with plaster and smelling of old brass, and inside was a single sheet of notarized paper that 6 months later would dress my sister-in-law in an orange jumpsuit and an apron that reads "Checked Out Trust." But the path from that hidden safe to her scrubbing porcelain with a toothbrush started with a funeral, a $6,000 check pressed into my palm like a tip for a waitress, and a quiet voice in my mother's handwriting telling me to save myself. My parents had run Willowmere House, a white Victorian bed and breakfast with a wraparound porch and a tea service that went back 4 generations, for over 40 years. I grew up on its 3rd floor, learning to sand a sash window by age 12 and to balance a tray of Devonshire cream without spilling by 14. When my husband passed a decade ago, I moved back to help them, trading a career in architectural conservation for the rhythm of lavender scones and creaking floorboards. I became the woman who could rekey a Mordi's lark faster than the local larksmith, and who knew that the 3rd tread on the back staircase always groaned at 6 a.m. when the boiler kicked on. I never had children, never remarried. The inn was my child, and I had poured a $95,000 home equity conversion mortgage into restoring its plumbing, its sash windows, and its historic tea parlor 3 years ago, with my sister-in-law Vanessa standing right beside me, smiling, promising a 50-50 partnership and a lifetime of high tea. She had signed a notarized partnership agreement that very afternoon, her gold pen scratching across the heavy linen paper while I held my breath with hope. She wore a cream silk blouse and commented on the wainscoting's charming patina. My parents watched from the doorway and they said nothing, but my mother's eyes lingered on Vanessa a beat too long. My father, a man who could fix any boiler but rarely spoke of feelings, began polishing the brass door handles obsessively after that day. That was the only hint I ever got. My older brother Paul had always been the golden child, the one who got the car at 16 while I took the bus, but my parents never warmed to his wife. She was too polished, too careful, the kind of woman who complimented your china while calculating its auction value behind her smile. When Mom and Dad passed within 7 months of each other, first Dad's heart and then Mom simply letting go, the will was straightforward. The B&B came to me outright, the antique tea service included, and Paul received a modest savings account that Vanessa called insulting. The funeral hadn't even ended before they were circling. I was still wearing my black dress, still holding a casserole dish from a neighbor, when Paul and Vanessa walked through the inn's front door not to mourn but to manage. Vanessa started in the dining room, flipping over teacups to read their maker's marks, muttering about maximizing the estate. She photographed the silver tea strainers with her phone, taking close-ups of the hallmarks. Paul kept patting my shoulder and saying, "We'll take care of everything, you just rest." Their voices echoed through the empty parlor where, 2 days earlier, I had held my mother's hand for the last time. That evening, while I was sweeping the library floor because I couldn't sleep and needed the familiar rhythm, the bristles caught a baseboard nail that had worked loose. I knelt to pry the nail free with my fingernail, and I noticed a tiny brass skeleton key, oxidized pale green, jammed in the crack behind the molding. It was thin and delicate, the bow shaped like a clover. I pulled it out and turned it over in my palm. I knew every lock in this house, or thought I did, but I'd never seen this key. And then I remembered my father once mentioning a hidden guest safe from the 1920s, a place where traveling salesmen would lock their pocket watches and cash. He'd said it was behind a false panel in the chimney breast, and he described how his own grandfather, the first innkeeper, had wired a mechanical bell to the safe so that any unauthorized attempt to open it would ring in the kitchen. I'd always assumed it was a story, one of those fireside tales old innkeepers tell to children. I carried a butter knife from the kitchen and pried at the edge of the raised panel on the chimney breast until it popped loose with a thick, satisfying crack of old paint. Behind it, set into the brick, was a small iron safe, no bigger than a shoebox, its face painted to match the brick so perfectly that even a close inspection would miss it. The key slid into the oval escutcheon, and the wards turned with a buttery click, the kind only a well-oiled lark makes after a century. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger embossed with Guest Registry 1887 in gold flake, but when I lifted it out, the center had been hollowed, and a thin manila folder rested in the cavity. Paul's voice cut through the hall just then. "What are you doing in there?" I slipped the folder back into the hollowed book, closed the safe, and pushed the panel mostly shut. My heart hammered against my ribs like a boiler gauge. He stepped in, saw the ledger in my hand, and rolled his eyes. "Mom's old craft projects," he said. Vanessa drifted in behind him, peered at the dusty book, and sniffed. "Toss it. We're not running a museum, and clutter lowers appraisal value." Tomorrow morning, the estate sale company comes to catalogue, and I'm not paying them to sort garbage. She took the ledger from Paul's hand without even opening it and dropped it onto a pile of broken curtain rods, mildewed books, and outdated phone books destined for the dumpster behind the carriage house. The book landed with a thud that made me flinch. I said nothing, just nodded with the blank, foggy expression of a grieving woman. After they went upstairs to secure valuables, I walked outside into the cold night air, retrieved the ledger from the heap of trash, and carried it to my room under my coat like a stolen child. Dust from the chimney settled on my tongue. Inside the hollowed book, I opened the folder with trembling fingers. On top was the original notarized partnership agreement, dated exactly 3 years prior, between me and Vanessa Grace Thorne, signed and stamped by a notary named Rebecca Thorne. The ink was crisp, the embossed seal intact, the language ironclad. We were co-owners 50-50 in the renovation and operation of Willowmere House, funded by the reverse mortgage I had taken out. The document listed every detail: the Heckham loan number, the scope of work including plumbing, rough-in and roof restoration, even a clause requiring mutual consent before any sale or transfer. I remembered signing it, remembered Vanessa's bright talk of tea festivals and bridal showers. But underneath that sheet, tucked behind a folded copy of the mortgage note, was a scrap of parchment torn from a grocery shopping list with £2, butter, tea bags in my mother's handwriting. Below that in her shaky cursive 5 words, "Do not trust Vanessa, save yourself." I pressed the paper to my lips and started to shake. My mother had known. She had seen the shark beneath the silk, and even in her final months when her hands trembled too much to pour tea, she had hidden this warning in the one place a schemer would never look: the forgotten architecture of the past. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that some family bonds are just legal fictions waiting to be exposed. Vanessa wasted no time. The next morning, she appeared at my door with a mug of chamomile tea that tasted oddly metallic, so sweet it coated my tongue like glycerin, and began talking about how hard it must be for a widow alone to handle property tax deadlines and liability insurance. She had already drafted a durable power of attorney and a property management agreement, she said, just to take the paperwork off your shoulders. The document smelled of fresh laser printer toner, not a lawyer's office, and I noticed the notary block was already filled in with Rebecca Thorne's name and commission number, but the date was left blank. She slid them across the kitchen table, her manicured nail tapping the signature line. I picked up a pen, fumbled it deliberately so it rolled onto the floor and clattered against the radiator, then spent a full minute searching for it under the cast iron coils. When I surfaced, I blinked slowly, rubbed my temples and said, "I'm so foggy lately, Vanessa. The grief, the stress, my mind just dissolves. I don't want to sign anything I don't understand right now. I need to rest." She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her temples. The skin around her eyes tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, sweetheart, we'll move you into our place for a while. The guest room has a garden view and Paul can manage the inn while you recover. You'll be so much more comfortable away from all these memories." Recovery, I understood, meant being removed from all mail, all phone calls, and any prying eyes that might notice a for sale sign staked in the front lawn. That same afternoon, Paul disconnected the landline while upgrading the router, and Vanessa redirected the postal mail to a P.O. box she controlled. She told me it was so I wouldn't be bothered with bills. By the end of the week, I had packed a single suitcase and was installed in a disused guest room in their McMansion across town, the bedroom window overlooking a dead rose bed choked with bindweed and a barbecue grill dusted in cobwebs. The room smelled of plug-in air freshener and old carpet. There was a lock on the outside of the door, a simple sliding bolt which Vanessa said was for security, but I knew it could be slid from the hallway. Before I left Willowmere for the last time as its legal occupant, I tucked the partnership document and my mother's note inside the lining of a vintage hatbox in my own closet, behind a stack of old quilts and forgotten photo albums. I told no one. I ran my hand over the wallpaper one final time and memorized the pattern of roses and thorns. Living under Vanessa's roof was like being submerged in lukewarm water, quiet and suffocating. I played my part, shuffling around in slippers, asking the same question twice, leaving my reading glasses in the refrigerator. I let my hair go unbrushed and wore the same cardigan for 3 days. Meanwhile, I began to notice the small things that only someone trained in observation could collect. Vanessa took phone calls at 2 a.m., her voice a sharp whisper that carried through the HVAC ducts. She paced the upstairs landing with a phone pressed to her ear, hissing phrases like escrow shortfall, "We need to accelerate the buyer's due diligence," and the title company is asking about the estate filing. I heard fragments. Warranty deed already recorded. I told you, Thorne, I'm handling it. 3 weeks after I moved in, a brand new Lexus appeared in the driveway, the window sticker still on the passenger glass, the Monroney label showing a price north of $62,000. Paul mentioned she'd paid cash, claiming a consulting bonus. I asked no questions, but I started keeping a mental log, dates, snippets of conversation, the number of times she dodged calls from the county assessor's office. I noted that the trash bin in the garage overflowed with empty cold brew cans and late-night takeout containers, and one morning I found the shredder bin outside the office had spilled, a torn strip of paper reading Meridian Heritage Prop, visible before she kicked it under a cabinet. The moment I shifted from passive observer to active investigator came on a Tuesday afternoon when Vanessa and Paul were both out at a business lunch with a real estate attorney. The guest bedroom doorknob, an antique glass faceted knob on a notarized lock set, stuck constantly, a brass spindle worn down over decades of lazy turns. I'd offered to fix it, and Vanessa had been delighted, grateful even, not realizing that my toolkit included a set of lock picks I'd kept in my purse for over 20 years. I learned the skill out of necessity during my first year back at the inn, when an elderly guest had accidentally locked himself in his room during a fire alarm, and the local locksmith was 40 minutes away. The fire department was going to break down a 100-year-old oak door, and I couldn't bear it, so I called the locksmith, bought a basic pick set, and made him teach me over the phone while the alarm blared. By the time the truck arrived, I had the door open. After that, I practiced on every lock in the house, learning the feel of binding pins under a tension wrench, the subtle feedback of a spool pin false set, the whisper of a wafer lock raking open. I had retumbled the front door myself to a high-security Schlage primer cylinder, a restricted keyway that couldn't be duplicated at a hardware store without a signed authorization card. I knew locks better than I knew my own grief. After I adjusted the doorknob spindle with a small file, tightening the set screw and lubricating the mechanism with graphite, I walked down the hall to Paul's home office. The office had its own separate entrance from the garage, ostensibly because he worked on vague consulting projects that required client privacy. The door to the interior hallway was locked, a basic Schlage keyed knob, nothing commercial grade. I knelt, pulled out a slim leather case the size of a coin purse, selected a tension wrench with a twisted end and a standard hook pick with a slight reach, and set to work. I inserted the wrench into the bottom of the keyway and applied light clockwise torque, just enough to feel the friction of the pins. Then I slid the hook in and began probing from the back to the front. Pin 5, a bit of resistance, lifted with a soft click. Pin 4, nothing. Pin 3, a click. Pin 2 felt mushy, a security pin, so I eased off the tension, felt the counter rotation of the plug and set it. Pin 1, a clean lift, a slight increase in torque, and the plug rotated a fraction of an inch. The latch retracted with a smooth snick. I slipped inside and locked the door behind me with the thumb turn. The office smelled of dry toner and paper dust, the cloying scent of stale coffee. A tall metal filing cabinet, a Hahn 4-drawer vertical, stood beside a desk cluttered with unpaid credit card bills, Starbucks receipts, and a stack of manila folders. The cabinet was locked too, a small disc-shaped cam lock. Filing cabinet locks are laughably simple, a flat wafer lock that demands only a jiggler or a small rake, and I had a double-sided rake that could pop them in seconds. I inserted the rake, wiggled it vigorously, and turned the cylinder. Open. I began flipping through the tabs, my innkeeper's mind automatically categorizing every piece of data. The first drawer contained hanging folders labeled taxes, insurance, and wills. The second drawer was more interesting, Willowmere Project. I pulled the entire folder and laid it on the desk. The first document was a copy of a general warranty deed, recorded 6 weeks ago at the County Recorder's Office, Book 8472, page 326. It transferred Willowmere House, the entire parcel from me as grantor, to a shell company called Verdant Holdings LLC, a domestic limited liability company registered to a P.O. box in the next town. My signature was scrawled on the page beside the notary jurat, a gloppy imitation of my name that missed the distinctive loop I always make on the capital L, and the way I cross my T with a slight downward flick. The date of the supposed signing was the day after my father's funeral, when I was at the church arranging flowers. I had a clear alibi if needed. The notary stamp belonged to Rebecca Thorne, commission number 1,123,456, expiring in 2026, my own notary, the same woman who had notarized the partnership agreement. She was Vanessa's cousin, and I now understood that she was a co-conspirator. The jurat worded, personally appeared before me Catherine Elaine Rhodes, known to me to be the person whose name is subscribed, was a brazen lie. Behind the deed, I found the purchase and sale agreement between Verdant Holdings and a boutique hotel group called Meridian Heritage Properties, a chain known for restoring historic inns. Sale price, $780,000. The terms included a 45-day due diligence period, a requirement for a Phase I environmental assessment, and an assignment of historic preservation easement that would have stripped all local protections. A separate bill of sale listed the historic tea service, china and silver samovars, and the Jasperware collection my great-grandmother had brought from England for an additional $47,000. Below that, a settlement statement, a HUD-1 form, showed the breakdown. Sale price, less the reverse mortgage payoff of $91,237, less closing costs of $14,000, less a management fee of $82,000 payable to Vanessa Grace Thorne. The net proceeds line item in bold at the bottom read, $6,000,00. Attached was a photocopy of a cashier's check from Verdant Holdings to me, dated 2 days after the funeral, the same check Vanessa would soon press into my hand with a smile and call a gift from the buyers for your trouble. The check was made out to Catherine Rhodes, and it had never been deposited because I had never seen it. I photographed every page with my phone, careful to capture the forged signature, the notary stamp, the county recorder's book and page numbers, and the date stamps on the cover sheet. My hands were steady, but my mind was fire. I replaced the folder exactly as I found it, noting the position of a paper clip on the 5th page. Then I kept digging, knowing that a fraud of this magnitude always leaves more skin cells. The 3rd drawer held personal files. Inside a folder labeled Estate Correspondence, I found a letter from the estate attorney, a man named Arthur Holbrook, addressed to me at the inn, but with the envelope torn open and resealed with a strip of clear tape. The letter was dated 3 weeks after my mother's death. I slipped the pages out, my breath shallow. Mr. Holbrook wrote to inform me that, per my parents' final codicil to their will, drafted 18 months before their deaths, the Willowmere property had been placed in a spendthrift trust with a non-dispositive poison pill clause. The trust was named the Rhodes Family Heritage Trust, with First County Bank as the institutional co-trustee. The trust restricted any sale, mortgage, or transfer of title for a term of 5 years from the date of my mother's death unless I, the primary beneficiary, personally appeared before a notary in the presence of a bank trust officer and executed a specific consent form, Form TR-22, that had to be car-signed by the trust officer themselves. Any attempt to sell the property before that date, or to record a deed without satisfying these requirements, would trigger an automatic title audit by the county recorder's office within 10 business days. Moreover, the poison pill clause, paragraph 9(c), stated that any beneficiary who attempted to defraud or misappropriate trust assets would forfeit their entire inheritance, and all proceeds and property would revert to the trust estate to be distributed to secondary beneficiaries or charitable remaindermen. The letter concluded with, "If you receive this letter after any deed has been recorded, please contact this office immediately, as a fraud may already be in progress. The trust contains a dead man's switch mechanism that will freeze the title upon recording without the co-trustee endorsement." My mother had built a legal tripwire into the very soil of the inn. She had probably suspected Vanessa's greed even before she got sick, and working with Arthur Holbrook, she had constructed a trap that required the fraudster to walk into the recorder's office blindfolded. I photographed this letter too, then carefully realigned the envelope's flap. I now had the evidence that the deed was void from the moment it hit the index, but I also realized that Vanessa would eventually discover the trust's restriction and attempt to forge the consent form as well, perhaps with Rebecca's help. The trap was sprung, but the prey hadn't felt the steel yet. I called Arthur Holbrook from a payphone outside a 24-hour gas station the next morning, using a burner phone I'd bought with cash from a big box store, no ID required. I identified myself and read the letter's reference number. His voice shifted instantly to a mixture of relief and professional fury. He confirmed that the bank's trust department had flagged the recording 9 days after it appeared in the Grantor Grantee Index, because the deed lacked the required co-trustee endorsement. A compliance officer named MS Geeta Varma had placed a title freeze and opened a case. The county's real estate fraud unit, a division of the district attorney's office, had already assigned an investigator, Detective Okonkwo, who specialized in elder exploitation and deed fraud. But they needed the original partnership agreement to prove I had never authorized a sale, and they needed my sworn statement to substantiate the forgery. Arthur also mentioned that Meridian Heritage Properties had been contacted. Their general counsel was furious, having wired a deposit of $100,000 into an escrow account controlled by Vanessa's LLC, and they were cooperating fully. He asked me to meet him at his office the following week, but he also said the DA's office wanted to let the fraud play out a bit longer, to gather evidence of wire fraud and conspiracy across state lines, which would elevate the charges to federal level. I agreed, but before handing over the originals, I needed one piece of evidence that no courtroom could ignore: a recording of Vanessa's true character. I needed to know whether any scrap of human decency existed in my brother's wife, so I staged a collapse. It was a simple plan, the kind of practical theatre I once used to catch a seasonal employee who was stealing cash from the tea room register. I purchased a digital baby monitor with a long-range receiver and a recording function that dumped audio onto a micro SD card. I planted the camera base unit behind a large potted fern in the upstairs hallway, its lens angled toward the stairs, and synced it to the parent unit hidden in my pocket. I tested it discreetly, speaking a soft phrase that I confirmed would pick up from the hallway. The next morning, while Vanessa was at the kitchen table with her laptop and a stack of documents, and Paul was somewhere in the garage pretending to organize tools, I walked to the top of the stairs. I waited until I heard her chair scrape, then let out a short cry, a genuine-sounding yelp of pain, and crumpled to the floor, clutching my chest with one hand and grasping the banister with the other. I lay there on the hardwood, breathing shallowly, my eyes half closed but tracking her every movement through slitted lids. I moaned, "Vanessa, help me, I can't breathe." My chest, it's squeezing, please. I made my voice thin and reedy. I heard her footsteps crossing the foyer, the clop of her heels on the tile, and for one wild, stupid second I thought she might kneel down beside me, might even call an ambulance. Instead, she stepped over my legs without breaking stride, the sharp edge of her heel actually nudging my hip as she passed, and she walked directly into the guest room where she'd been keeping the Verdant Holdings closing documents. She came back out 30 seconds later with a manila folder tucked under her arm, looked down at me still lying on the floor, and said in a voice utterly devoid of concern, "I don't have time for this, I have a closing in 20 minutes. Call Paul, you're fine, it's probably just indigestion from those scones you keep eating." Then she walked out the front door. The door slammed. I lay on that floor for another 10 minutes, staring at the crown molding, the baby monitor's red light blinking steadily in the fern fronds, capturing every second of silence, my ragged breathing, and the distant rumble of her Lexus reversing out the driveway. When I finally sat up, I felt my heart, not in medical distress, but utterly cold. Any residual family loyalty I had held for my brother's wife was extinguished. I pressed the monitor's save button and whispered to myself, "No mercy." That night I packed my single suitcase again and slipped out while they were at a dinner with the so-called buyers. I retrieved the hatbox from the inn, drove to a motel 2 towns over under an assumed name, and slept for the first time in weeks with both eyes closed. The next morning I met Arthur Holbrook at his office, a modest brick building with a brass plaque. I surrendered the original partnership agreement and my mother's handwritten note, now sealed in a plastic evidence sleeve. Detective Okonkwo was there, a tall woman with silver-threaded braids and a voice like a cello. She took my statement on the record, copied my photos, and validated the audio file from the baby monitor. She asked me if I would be willing to return to the inn and wait for the confrontation, because they needed Vanessa to attempt the final coerced signature in front of witnesses to solidify the conspiracy charge. I agreed without hesitation. As I left, Arthur handed me a key to the bank's safe deposit box where the original trust instrument was held, a symbolic gesture. He said, "Your mother was a brilliant woman. She told me my daughter will find the key, the house will tell her." I smiled through tears. 3 days later I returned to Willowmere House. I had the locks changed by a bonded locksmith I trusted, but I rekeyed each cylinder myself while he watched, installing new Schlage Primus high-security cylinders with restricted keys that could not be duplicated without a signed authorization card. I reset the alarm code to a 6-digit number only I knew, and I settled back into the small owner's apartment above the kitchen. I didn't try to hide. I made a fresh pot of Earl Grey and waited. Vanessa found out within hours. At 9 a.m., the next day her Lexus screeched into the gravel drive, spraying pebbles against the porch. She marched into the parlor with Paul trailing behind her and 2 men in expensive overcoats, clearly representatives from Meridian Heritage Properties. Their faces were tight with forced neutrality, but I saw the senior man glance at the original tin ceiling with a flicker of genuine admiration. Vanessa had told them I was a confused, grieving woman who just needed to sign the final consent to finalize the sale and avoid a messy, quiet title action. She believed she could bully me into papering over the fraud. She thrust a clipboard loaded with paperwork at me. "Sign these forms, Catherine. You've been hiding, you've been uncooperative, and you are going to ruin everything. The sale is done, it's recorded, and if you don't sign the consent amendment and the escrow release, we will all be sued for breach of contract. You'll lose this house anyway, and everyone will know you're incompetent." Her voice was a whip, and Paul stood behind her staring at his shoes. I sat behind the front desk, the same desk where my father had greeted guests for 40 years, its oak surface worn smooth by 1,000 elbows. A small digital audio player rested on the polished wood beside a vase of fresh lavender. I looked at the forged deed copy clipped to the board, then up at her. I said quietly and clearly, "This inn requires 2 signatures, Vanessa. The trust requires a co-trustee endorsement I never gave. I never signed that deed. You forged my name." Vanessa's face contorted, the mask of polished care slipping. "You're lying. You signed the transfer authorization weeks ago. You just don't remember because you're on so much medication. You're a confused widow who can't even fix a doorknob." She thrust a pen at me, her hand shaking. I didn't take it. Instead, I reached over and pressed play on the audio player. I had routed it through the house intercom system, which I knew from my wedding reception could fill every room. Through the speakers hidden in the ceiling, filling the soaring parlor with its original pressed tin, Vanessa's voice echoed clear as a bell. "I don't have time for this, I have a closing in 20 minutes. Call Paul." Then silence, a door slam. Then my own whisper captured faintly, "No mercy." The Meridian Heritage representatives exchanged sharp glances. The senior man, who had introduced himself earlier as Mark Chen, took a deliberate step backward, removing himself physically from Vanessa's presence. Paul went pale. At that moment the front door opened, the little bell above it jingling, and Arthur Holbrook walked in with Detective Okonkwo, 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies, and a trust officer from First County Bank, MS. Geeta Varma, her badge clipped to her lapel. Vanessa turned, her mouth opening to spin some new lie about a misunderstanding, but Detective Okonkwo raised a warrant. "Vanessa Grace Thorne, you are under arrest for forgery in the 1st degree, felony real estate fraud, attempted grand theft, identity theft, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." She read the Miranda rights in a calm, unassailable tone. Paul started shouting about lawyers and entrapment, but the deputies were already cuffing Vanessa's wrists behind her back. The audio recording looped once more, my sister-in-law's voice becoming the soundtrack of her own undoing. Mark Chen stepped forward and pointed a finger at her. "Meridian Heritage Properties will be filing our own charges for fraud in the inducement and wire fraud. That 100,000 deposit is frozen, and we will seek restitution." Vanessa, her composure finally shattered, spat at me. "You'll never run this place, you're nothing." I didn't react. I simply stood, walked around the desk and faced her. "I've been running this place since you were still trying to figure out which fork to use, the trust one. The deed is void, you own nothing." She was led away in handcuffs, her apricot blouse rumpled, her heels scuffing the porch. Paul followed, stammering assurances he didn't believe. The legal aftermath was as thorough as a well-drafted trust document. Vanessa's cousin Rebecca Thorne lost her notary commission and faced criminal charges for forging the jurat. The state's notary division revoked her seal, and she was convicted of a misdemeanor, but the real weight fell on Vanessa. 2 detectives from the fraud unit spent weeks piecing together the paper trail, reconstructing her digital footprints. They discovered that the $82,000 management fee she had pocketed from the fraudulent sale had been wired directly to pay off a secret second mortgage on her own McMansion and to satisfy a mountain of credit card debt, all incurred in the 18 months before my parents died. She had been planning this since the day she learned the inn was left solely to me, seeing me as a soft, lonely widow with no heirs she could manipulate into signing away her future. The court didn't see it that way. At trial, the prosecution introduced the original partnership agreement, the mother's note, the audio recording of her stepping over a dying woman, and the testimony of Arthur Holbrook and the trust officer. Vanessa was convicted on 4 felony counts. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in the state women's correctional facility, with an additional 4 years of supervised probation upon release, and restitution of $122,000 to the Rhodes Family Heritage Trust, to be garnished from any future wages or assets. Paul, who had been too spineless to object but too greedy to stop her, lost his inheritance entirely under the poison pill clause. The modest savings account he'd received reverted to the trust, and was distributed to a local hospice charity, per my parents' alternate instructions. The bank held the $780,000 in escrow, and after a quiet title action that took 62 days, the fraudulent deed was declared void ab initio. The property reverted to me free and clear, no longer encumbered by the reverse mortgage, which the trust paid off from the damages settlement with the hotel group. Meridian Heritage settled out of court with the trust for an undisclosed sum, but enough to fully restore the inn's endowment and fund a small legal defense fund for elderly homeowners facing deed fraud. I used a portion of the restitution to retire the reverse mortgage in full, restore the tea parlour's original Victorian wallpaper pattern, and install a small brass plaque in the library beside the chimney breast. It reads, "In this house, a key and a mother's words unlock the truth. Honour those who see through walls." I renamed the inn, of course. You can find Willowmere House now listed under a new name, Inn of Deceit. The brochure tells guests the story in broad strokes, because honesty about the past brings its own kind of tourists, people who appreciate that a building can survive betrayal as well as weather. And there's one other detail the judge allowed me to propose during the sentencing hearing. As part of Vanessa's probation and community service requirement, the court accepted my offer to supervise her at the inn for 500 hours. She shows up every Saturday at 8 a.m., dressed in the uniform I provide, a blue canvas apron with white block letters stitched across the chest that say "Checked Out Trust." Her first task is always the same. She scrubs the historic porcelain toilets in the public restrooms with a toothbrush, a new one each week. I stand in the doorway, silent, watching, remembering my mother's 5 words, and every single guest receipt, whether for a weekend stay or a pot of Earl Grey and a scone, automatically prints a footer line that reads, "Fraud Docket No. CR 2023-0482. My parents spent their lives building a place of warmth and welcome, and even in death they protected it with a quiet legal architecture that only a mother's intuition could design. I learned that the loudest family betrayals often leave the quietest paper trails, and that a woman with a tension wrench, a knowledge of county recorder indexes, and a refusal to be foggy forever is not someone you should ever underestimate. I'm still here, pouring tea and cutting keys, and every creak of the third back stair at 6 a.m. feels like my mother walking beside me. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. If you believe that truth leaves a paper trail no amount of white out can erase, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories of ordinary people who turned a locked room into a trap for the guilty. Until next time, stay sharp and check your notary stamps.